Okay, welcome everybody, and it's wonderful to see such a wonderful turnout on such a miserable day, but of course we're going to turn it into a great day with two brilliant speakers, and we can see because everybody's come to hear. So just first of all, welcome to our fourth penultimate Interfaith Learning for All series, where we talk about things based on different texts of different faiths, and in a very challenging way, in a very insightful way. And you will have your chance after our two speakers to ask questions or make contributions, but just while they're speaking, we won't take anything, otherwise we will never manage to have both the two speakers, and they're also going to have an interdialogue with each other after each one spoke. So, thank you very, very much, Scott and Rabbi Mark. I probably don't even need to introduce both of you, but just to all the fans of Scott, I'll introduce Rabbi Mark, and then I'll introduce Scott to all the other way about, right? Just in case. So, Rabbi Mark Solomon has been the minister of Sukkot Shalom, and indeed you served the Leicester Progressive Shul for over 20 years, as long as I can remember, Rabbi Mark, which is more than that, I think. And he chairs the Bet Din of the Liberal Judaism and is senior lecturer at the Leah Beck. Rabbi Mark also teaches Kabbalah and Hasidim, and definitely Maimonides, which we've had a few rounds of, thank you. Both of which greatly talk about symbols of light and darkness, which we're going to discuss tonight. So I think what I'll do is I'll welcome you both. So I'll say a few words about you too, Scott, even if you wanted me to repeat some of them. And please feel free to add other things that are relevant when you present. So Reverend Dr. Scott McKenna, who I well remember from his Edinburgh days, so it's lovely to have you back again. A minister in the Church of Scotland for over 30 years, in both Ayr and in Edinburgh. And you're currently serving as the spiritual lead at the Ayrshire Hospice, which I'm sure is incredibly inspirational for both. You've had a long interest in the mystical Christianity, including some of the Scottish Presbyterian tradition. Thank you both very much for coming and speaking to everybody and with each other. So with no more ado, thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. We've decided that I will go first, and I would stand up at the lectern, as I think Scott will, but I hope you'll forgive me if I stay seated. I've got a rather painful hip at the moment, and so I hope that's okay. I could say it doesn't make a great deal of difference whether I stand up or sit down. So when Jane and Janet kindly asked me to speak at one of the Interfaith Learning for All sessions, they also asked me to find my own fellow speaker, and I had the happy inspiration of getting in touch with Scott. So even if I mess up tonight, which is quite likely, it's nice to know that so many of you have turned out for an opportunity to hear once again your beloved minister, I'm sure for some of you, Scott McKenna. So, we've called this To Dwell in Darkness, Light and Darkness in Jewish Mysticism, but our accent, I think, for both of us tonight will probably be on the darkness side of that. And I would like to start by asking you if you would close your eyes. What do you see? Nothing? Darkness? Maybe after images or patterns caused by the blood vessels in our eyelids, especially if we're surrounded by bright light. But mainly darkness. It's okay, you can open your eyes again now. Meditation usually, but not always, happens with the eyes closed. On a practical level, that is to eliminate distractions. At a deeper level, it might be to enable the mind to visualize signs that point to divine truths. For many Jewish mystics, that would mean visualizing Hebrew letters and combinations of letters. Or perhaps visualizing divine realms beyond physical sight. But at a deeper level still, it takes us into a realm of unity, of non-duality, without any differentiation. Sight and the light that makes it possible shows us a world of diversity, of multiplicity, of the surfaces of many things. Darkness takes us into our inner depths, beneath the surface, to where all is one. Light clarifies and distinguishes, but darkness blurs all distinctions and unites all opposites. We begin in darkness, in the womb, although the ancient rabbis like to say that we have a divine lamp shining above our heads in the womb. That's as may be, but on a practical, physical level, we begin in that warm darkness, and then we are born with our eyes closed, mostly. We act in light, but rest in darkness. And when we die, our mortal remains, at least, return to the darkness of the earth. This is expressed in one of the opening prayers of our liberal Shabbat morning service. Eternal God, a mystery surrounds my life. What came before it and what lies beyond it are shrouded in darkness. But in the darkness is your presence, and in the mystery, your love. In our habitual binary thinking, darkness is often conceived of as morally negative. Light equals life, knowledge, and goodness, while darkness equals death, ignorance, and evil. In religious traditions, including Judaism and Christianity, light is certainly one of the most pervasive metaphors for God, or for the influence that flows to us from God, the divine light, while evil is often associated with the so-called powers of darkness. We have festivals of light, but I don't think there are any festivals of darkness, at least not in Judaism or Christianity. How many times after the horrific Hanukkah massacre at Bondi Beach, not yet 6 weeks ago, did we hear and speak of the light overcoming the darkness? Tonight, though, Scott and I would like to explore with you another meaning of darkness beyond easy binaries, where darkness and light coexist not as opposites or adversaries, but in an intertwined and complementary way. You might want to think of the Taoist symbol of yin and yang, and where darkness itself is a symbol of God, or God's dwelling place. I know that Scott will be sharing some material from the Christian New Testament, so I will cite passages from our shared Hebrew scriptures, and I'd want to start with the imagery of creation itself. In Genesis, before God says, "Let there be light," we read in the second verse, "There was darkness over the face of the deep, and the Ruach of God hovering over the face of the water." Ruach could mean wind, or it could mean spirit. In biblical poetry, we often have a technique of parallelism, where the same thing is said in different words within a verse. And so in this case, over the face of the deep is parallel to over the face of the water. And therefore, darkness parallels the Ruach, the spirit or wind of God. This suggests that there is something profoundly holy about this darkness, which Genesis tells us pre-existed what we think of as creation. Now, in the history of Jewish biblical interpretation, there have been endless speculations about the meanings, the hidden meanings of all of the details of the creation story. And I can't unpack all of the interpretations of that dark, primordial darkness. But I do want to share a couple of mystical texts from the Middle Ages. Firstly, from a book probably very little known except to specialists in Jewish mysticism. It's called Makor HaChochma, the Fountain of Wisdom, and it emanated in the early 13th century, early 1200s, from a circle known as the Circle of Contemplation. We don't know their names, but a circle of mystics, probably in Provence, in the south of what we now call France. And although it's quite an obscure book in some ways, it was deeply influential in all the subsequent history of Jewish mysticism. It was much loved amongst the mystics. And this book, the Fountain of Wisdom, has interesting things to say about this darkness. This is tricky language, so don't worry if not every detail is instantly clear. But the book says, this corresponds to the primal darkness that ushered forth from the ether, from the primordial atmosphere. Do not hasten to investigate or contemplate it, for even Moses, our Rabbi of blessed memory, was not allowed to ask questions about it. But then he did ask his pointed question, as it is stated when Moses is encountering God in Exodus chapter 34, and says, "Please inform me of your ways." The Holy One, ever to be blessed, responded to him concerning this matter, "You cannot see my face." That is to say, the knowledge of this darkness that you are requesting, for it was all of me and my source. You are unable to clearly fathom an examination of it. Accordingly, you will not possess knowledge of this darkness that is the focal point of my existence. This is extraordinarily powerful language about darkness as the very essence of the divine, at a level where the human mind can't really penetrate. Everything from there onwards, it says, however, from here on, from that darkness onwards, you shall know everything. Everything that flows out of the darkness is knowable, but the darkness itself, which is the focal point, the essential point of God, that we're not granted, not even Moses is granted knowledge of. This may have influenced the much more famous book called the Zohar, the Book of Radiance, from the late 13th century, written in extremely obscure Aramaic. But this is a passage right at the very beginning of the Zohar. It's the most famous and fundamental text of Kabbalah, of mainstream Jewish mysticism. And the Zohar on the portion of Bereshit, of Genesis, begins as follows. At the beginning of the power of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed, from the head of infinity. A cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring. Don't ask me what that means. Not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a cord stretched out, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark, this is the spark of impenetrable darkness, gushed a flow, splaying colours below, concealed within the concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof, the infinite. Mystics, of course, love paradoxical language because they point to ideas, truths, concepts that can barely be grasped, that are beyond a sort of completely rational analysis. And so we get phrases like this all through the Zohar, but this is one of the most famous, Botsina de Cardinuta in the Aramaic, a spark of impenetrable darkness, as it's translated by most recent translator, who tries to grasp the idea that the Cardinuta might mean darkness or might mean hardness. So he translates it as impenetrable darkness. But it's a paradox. How can you have a spark of darkness? A spark is surely light. So what this points to is a light, as it were, beyond light, a light that is so invisible, so impenetrable, that it can be called darkness. I think I'll skip some of the other Zohar quotations that I have here. There is a contemporary rabbi in Seattle named Fern Feldman who has made a long study of the concept of sacred darkness. And they explain, light here issues from the darkness that precedes creation. So light here issues from the darkness that precedes creation, the place of the hidden one, the one that cannot be seen or known directly. And then night, the lower world darkness, the night that we experience here in our world, can carry us back to a deeper level of consciousness, to that darkness which was carved out by the strokes of the hidden one. This text teaches us of the holiness of the night and its potential to connect us to the deepest level of the sacred imaginable. And this relates to the fact that in both the Talmudic Judaism of the ancient rabbis and amongst the Kabbalists, there was a particular merit ascribed to studying in the depths of the night. You could gain insights in the middle of the night that you might not be able to gain in the broad daylight. She continues, it also evokes the awareness that there is not just one type of darkness and one type of light, but layer upon layer, wave upon wave of dark and light, making diffraction patterns that ripple in all directions. And again, I think I'll skip my next Zohar quotation. Let's turn now from creation imagery to the book of Exodus and the account of the giving of the Torah. We read there how God descends upon the mountain in thick cloud with thunder and lightning, and then just after the proclamation of the 10 Commandments, or 10 utterances as they're called in Judaism, and the people say to Moses, you go and talk to God for us. We can't bear any more hearing God anymore. It's too overwhelming, too dangerous for us. And so we read in Exodus 20:18, Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. The arafel is the Hebrew word, the thick darkness where God was. The ancient Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century explains this as follows in his Life of Moses. He says, Moses entered into the darkness where God was, that is, into the unseen, invisible, incorporeal and archetypal essence of existing things. Thus he beheld what is hidden from the sight of mortal nature, and in himself and his life, displayed for all to see, he has set before us like some well-wrought picture, a piece of work beautiful and godlike, a model for those who are willing to copy it. Happy are they who imprint that image in their souls. So what Philo is saying is that through entering into or drawing near to that thick darkness, that sort of divine prototype of all existence, Moses assimilates that into himself. Moses becomes a kind of image of the divine presented to us in the Torah for our imitation, for our education. One of the Jewish mystical techniques is called gematria, which means adding up the numerical value of Hebrew words, because each Hebrew letter is also a number, and so you can make sums out of words and then compare different words. And a medieval commentator and legal authority called Jacob ben Asher, the Baal HaTurim, in his commentary on that verse in Exodus, points out that the word ha'arafel, the thick darkness, has the same numerical value as Shekhinah, the divine presence, the indwelling presence of God. And if you wonder what that is, it's 385. 385 is the sum of both words, ha'arafel, the thick darkness, and Shekhinah, for those who like such things. So he equates the thick darkness that Moses entered to receive Torah with the divine presence itself. To skip a few centuries forward to Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, one of the most remarkable Hasidic teachers of the 19th century in Poland, he comments that in one of his books that the Arafel, the thick darkness, is the essence, the ikar, and the innermost part, the pnimiut, and that is why the divine presence was there. That thick darkness is where we can experience in some way the divine essence. Another place where this Arafel, this thick darkness, appears is at the account of the dedication of Solomon's temple. And so we read that after the priests have brought the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies in the temple that King Solomon built in Jerusalem, then the house of the Eternal One, was filled with a cloud. And the priests could not stand and serve because of the cloud. For the kavod of the Eternal One. Now, kavod is usually translated the glory of the Eternal One. But it's an interesting word because it's related to the Hebrew verb to be heavy. Glory is the weight of divine glory. And this weight here was manifested in the thick darkness which had filled the house of God. And then we read in 1 Kings chapter 8, then Solomon said, Amar Adonai lishkon barafel, the Eternal One promised to dwell in the thick darkness. It's God's assurance, says King Solomon, just as it was for Moses in the tabernacle in the wilderness, that when that thick cloud is manifested in a holy place, that is the sign that God has come to dwell there. I want to suggest now that it's not just for Moses or for King Solomon or indeed for mystics that God's presence can be experienced in this sense as a sort of darkness, but for ourselves as well. And here we can draw on many verses in the book of Psalms, for instance, which uses the symbol of shade or shadow or covering over for the divine. So in Psalm 91, one who dwells in the seter, the secret place, the shelter of the Most High, abides in the shadow of the Almighty. God will cover you with his pinions, and under God's wings shall you take refuge. So although in many other psalms God is seen in the symbolism of light, for with you is the fountain of life, in your light do we see light, many other such verses, we also have the idea of God as the shade, the shadow, obviously in the hot Middle Eastern sun, a patch of shadow could be a very welcome thing indeed. A bit of shelter from the blazing sun, like Jonah's gourd. So this is one of the images for God. So in Psalm 121 also, I lift up my eyes unto the hills, we read, the Eternal One is your shade on your right hand. Tzilcha, it could also mean your shadow. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, one of the other great Hasidic teachers of the late 18th, early 19th century, said, it's like a shadow. When we cast a shadow, whatever we do, our shadow does as well. If you stretch out your arm, your shadow stretches out its arm. He said, so we should act in kind and charitable and righteous ways, because then God, who is our shadow, will act in similar ways to us and for us. Interesting play upon the idea of God as our shadow. In ritual, every morning when one puts on a talit, those who put on a prayer shawl for their morning prayers, which we wrap around ourselves and say a blessing, and cover up the eyes, one of the verses from Psalms that's said as a meditation is, how precious is your loving kindness, O God. Human beings take refuge under the shadow of your wings. So we physically wrap ourselves in the talit as though it is God wrapping us, covering us in God's wings, like a parent bird sheltering its chicks underneath its wings, which is another symbol much loved of biblical writers. And now coming to my final theme, which is the idea that when we speak about light and darkness, we can link these two, in a way, to the duality of words and silence. If light is the manifestation of God, words also are God's revelation. But if darkness is the hidden essence of God, then silence is where we encounter that in our minds. And this feeds into a particular kind of Jewish philosophy, most famously exemplified by Moses Maimonides, whom Jane mentioned at the beginning. Not usually classed as a mystic, although many scholars do think there is more than a tinge of mysticism in Maimonides' thought. I happen to agree. Maimonides famously speaks of negative theology, that we cannot positively use any words to describe God. We try to, but we constantly have to remind ourselves that none of our human words and none of our human concepts is actually applicable to God. That the reality of God is something utterly beyond any kind of words, any kind of expression, even any kind of imaging. This is sometimes called apophatic theology, theology beyond speech. And I think Scott is going to come back to that theme. And so for Maimonides, the process of trying to know God, insofar as it's even possible to do that, has to be a process of taking any word or any image that is applied to God, including all of those in the Bible, and stripping away from it anything that matches to our human understanding. And for Maimonides, it's not enough just to say that you're doing that. You have to do the hard work of going through every word, every image, every possible attribute of God, and stripping away anything that relates to our normal understanding of it, and to realize that the reality of God is utterly inexpressible. He exalts the value of silence. He takes the verse in the Psalms, which is sometimes translated, "To use silence is praise, the only true praise." And in his beginning of his famous discussion of the attributes of God, he concludes the first chapter there with the verse from Psalm 4, "Commune with your heart upon your bed and be still," which means be silent. And so we come back once again to the darkness of night, when we're lying in bed, and of course when we're not lost in our dreams. Maimonides says we should use those hours of darkness whenever we find ourselves lying awake to rehearse and to practice this process of stripping away every positive image, every meaningful word that could apply to God, which could limit the idea of God and create a God in an image, as it were, which would be a kind of idol. That's the best we can do in knowing God, and it's something that we do best in the darkness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and a real pleasure to accept your invitation, your kind invitation this evening, and to speak alongside Mark, for whom I have an immense respect. I'm grateful to everyone who has turned up, and may I say I'm especially grateful to those who are from Newington Trinity, familiar faces. It's good to see you. So this evening, rather than offer a brief lecture on Christian mysticism in general, in the short time that I have, I shall reflect on aspects of Christian mysticism that have long spoken to me. So as not to overlap too much, I shall avoid, as far as I can, drawing on many of the rich passages in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible that Christian mystics have drawn upon freely. Let me begin with a poem, a pondering on the absence and presence of God, written by the Welsh priest and poet, the late R.S. Thomas. It is called simply The Absence. It is this great absence that is like a presence that compels me to address it without hope of a reply. It is a room I enter from which someone has just gone, the vestibule for the arrival of one who has not yet come. I modernize the anachronism of my language, but he is no more here than before. Genes and molecules have no more power to call him up than the incense of the Hebrews at their altars. My equations fail as my words do. What resource have I other than the emptiness without him of my whole being, a vacuum he may not abhor? I begin then with the paradox of God's absence, God's presence, which comes to us as absence. This approach has considerable appeal because God remains elusive, beyond our comprehension and definition. Elsewhere, Thomas wrote of the darkness that pervades all things, pervades his thoughts, and pervades the world we live in. In his poem, Threshold, he wrote, "I emerge from the mind's cave into the worst darkness outside, where things pass and the Lord is in none of them." In Christian mysticism, darkness is typically woven together with silence and spiritual emptiness. From Thomas in the 20th century, let me step back to the 14th century, briefly, to the anonymous work written in Middle English, The Cloud of Unknowing. Perhaps from the quill pen of a Carthusian monk, perhaps not. The advice offered to students is broadly to focus on our inner relationship with God in Jesus Christ, to deepen the spiritual life, however turbulent the political and social world may be. 14th century England, under Edward III, was in seemingly continual battle with France and the Scots, and it was internationally an unstable period with the Western Schism, not one, not even two, but with 3 popes. If religious turmoil was not enough, the population of Europe was being destroyed by the Black Death. Some estimates rise to 50 million people. Certainly England lost as much as 1/3 of its population. That's the context, the political context, the social context, the health context in which the author was writing. The author of The Cloud wrote, "You are to feed on the sweet food of God's love and dwell in his pastures. We are to be single-minded in seeking God. The journey, our purpose in this life, is to know God through everything." We read, "When you first begin, you may find only darkness, a cloud of unknowing. It will seem incomprehensible, meaningless, except that in your innermost will, you will feel a simple, steadfast intention reaching out towards God." We are to wait in this darkness as long as necessary. The author wrote, "For if you are ever to feel him or see him in this life, ever, it will always be in this darkness, this cloud." The core message of the author is to distinguish between knowing and loving. Knowing is the knowledge of the world, mathematics, physics, and the like. Loving is heart knowledge. As God is always incomprehensible to the rational mind, we therefore are to move to loving God rather than knowing God. Hence the title, The Cloud of Unknowing. God can be loved and not reasoned. By love he may be sought and held, but not by thought. The author reflects on meditation and commends meditation on the life and suffering of Jesus as a way into God. However, no matter how powerful these meditations may be, the one who seeks after God must leave these images and words behind. As we move from images and words, we increasingly enter into silence and emptiness, the cloud, the darkness. We are to have a naked intent directed to God. And again later, in great love and blind outreach, the soul seeks for the naked being of God alone. It's a stripping away. I shall not drift into the spiritual life of Julian of Norwich, but it's a similar sort of period. But she too was writing around the same time and pursuing the inner life in the midst of the most harrowing political instability and social suffering. And I actually think that's very important. People like The Cloud of Unknowing, Julian of Norwich, they are writing at times that are politically, internationally, and socially and health are very, very bad. Much worse than what we are experiencing today. And it's through this approach of darkness we hope to encounter the peace of God. As someone who works in a hospice, who is exposed to severe or intense suffering, I'm increasingly drawn to the theologies that have been formed in the midst of suffering, that takes suffering genuinely seriously. From the 14th century, let me travel to the 16th century, to the work of the Spanish priest and Carmelite friar St. John of the Cross. St. John's well-known work is The Dark Night of the Soul. St. John wrote, "If a man wishes to be sure of the road he travels on, he must close his eyes and walk in the dark." We typically understand that the left brain is concerned with reason, logic, and analysis, while the right brain is our intuition, creativity, and imagination, awareness. The psychiatrist, philosopher, and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist, who I think lives on Skye, writes of the two sides of the brain in his tome, The Master and Its Emissary. For McGilchrist, the master is the right brain, while the emissary is the left brain, the rational brain. He argues that our culture is far too dependent on the left brain, on reason, on logic. Religion, at its best, is rooted in the right brain, in intuition, imagination, and awareness. St. John of the Cross said that we must close our eyes if we are to see. This is to close our eyes to the rationality of the world, to the world of reason, logic, and reductive analysis. In religious terms, when we want to push this to distinguish between belief and faith, which is to say that the left brain, the rational brain, is a structure of dogmas, belief, whereas faith is moving into unknowing. John suffered terribly in his life. Again, here is another mystic who endured darkness on many different levels. John suffered terribly in his life, and through darkness, pain, and silence, he found union with God. That sense of union brought no relief from his tribulations. And I think that's so important. So often in life we hear people say, "What have I done to deserve this? Can God not take this away?" The theology that I'm talking about, and Mark has reflected on, has the sense that we can have a sense of union with God which does not bring relief from the tribulations in the events that happen to us. On his spiritual journey, the mystical dark night was never interrupted. God's absence for John never ceased. There was no getting round suffering, and John's experience of God, his intuition, awareness, was found in God's absence. John was imprisoned by his fellow monks for around about 9 months. He was imprisoned because he wanted to evolve the Carmelite order in a way that his fellow monks did not approve. He was imprisoned, beaten, and tortured. In his poem, I Cobbled Their Boots, John expresses something of his experience at the hands of his brothers, but also the sense that God is, in some sense at least, involved in all things. St. John wrote, "How could I love my fellow men who tortured me? One night I was dragged into a room and beaten near death with their shoes, striking me hundreds of times in the face, scarring me forever. I cried out for God to help until I fainted. That night in a dream more real than this world, a strap from the Christ's sandal fell from my bleeding mouth, and I looked at him, and he was weeping, and spoke, 'I cobbled their boots. How sorry I am. What moves all things is God.'" For John, entwined in this poem is his sense of God, of Christ, the evil deeds of his fellow monks, and the presence and entanglement of God. This is, in my opinion, good theology because it's honest. There is no get-out-of-jail card free for God. And that's in part what the poem says. What moves all things is God. At its heart, the dark night is an inflowing of God into the soul, which cleanses it of all ignorances and imperfections. The divine light is the dark night for two reasons. Firstly, that the transcendent and the wisdom of the transcendent is above the capacity of the human mind and soul to comprehend it. That's why it's dark. God will always be beyond human reach. God is always in the darkness. Every theology is metaphor. God is hidden behind it. Citing Psalm 46, David said of God, "Clouds and darkness are round about him." There is no familiar traditional understanding to comfort us. And the closer we are to the divine, the more we are to God's Spirit, the deeper the silence in our soul. The emptier we become, the fuller we are. This paradox runs through all of this theology. Secondly, the spirit for the dark night. The spiritual journey is often full of pain and torment. It's often a journey that we take alone. Suffering comes to us in many forms, but crucially, it can break us. Our prayers become meaningless, even that we can no longer pray. And the usual comforts of faith and faith community no longer mean anything to us. Sometimes events happen to us in life that break our faith. Our suffering is such. In the dark night, we may also see, at least at one level, the meaninglessness of life. That things happen to us that we start to ask basic questions about the very meaning of life. Our own wrongdoing and brokenness may all be tied up with this. For me, the theology of John of the Cross, this dark night, is real, deep-rooted, and is not superficial or trite in any way. It takes account of what real life is like. From the 16th century, I want to jump back 1,000 years to the 6th century, to the work of Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius. An unknown author, he differentiated between apophatic and cataphatic theologies. As in others, for Dionysius, the light of God was a blinding darkness. The essence of God cannot be known by humanity. Dionysius wrote of darkness beyond radiance, which in the 17th century poet Henry Vaughan rendered as dazzling darkness. Cataphatic theology is the positive use of words, which we've heard something about from Mark. The positive use of words, such as love, almighty, the all-powerful. It is to push human language to its very limits in order to express what we think and feel of the divine. However, apophatic theology acknowledges that everything we say in positive theology is limited. In a sense, everything we say in positive theology is not true. Every image, every concept, anything we claim of God in God's self is but an approximation. The finite cannot grasp the infinite. God is always in the dark. We live by faith and intuition, and it's entirely tentative. I offer just one quotation from Pseudo-Dionysius. In approaching God, the Trinity, the author is reaching beyond that. And this is what he writes. Trinity, higher than any being, any divinity, any goodness, guide of Christians in the wisdom of heaven, leads us up beyond unknowing and light, up to the farthest, highest peak of mystic scripture, where the mysteries of God's word lie simple, absolute, and unchangeable in the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence. 6th century. Dionysius spoke of a hidden silence. One of the greatest Christian mystics ever to have lived, Meister Eckhart, said, "Nothing in all creation is so like God as stillness." And again, there is no eloquence, he said, greater than the silence of God. And one of the liturgies he had with his people and his congregation, he would say to them, "God is light." And they would reply, "God is not light," which is wonderful. Scottish Presbyterianism is not often associated with mysticism, if I may say that graciously. I believe, speaking for myself, I believe that this lack of spiritual sensitivity in our tradition leaves the Church of Scotland, and perhaps Presbyterian denominations more generally, ill-equipped in the present time. The Church, it seems to me, speaking for the Church and not other faiths, the Church, it seems to me, needs a more nuanced and sophisticated theology than we tend to hear. However, there are some exceptions. In the 19th century, the blind minister of Inellin, of Argyll, and later in Stockbridge in Edinburgh, the Reverend George Matheson, is a powerful case in point. I believe his physical blindness is a central part of his spiritual story. In common with mystics across the religious tradition, Matheson believed in union with God. Not union with God in the next life, but union with the sacred here and now. For Matheson, the resurrection after death made no sense because we possess God's immortality now in this life. He said the Christian Bible, would lose nothing if we lost all of the appearances of the resurrection. Let me quote a short paragraph. "Teach me that the state after death exists already before death. Teach me that my immortality is not to come, that it is here, that it is now, that I taste the divine now. Teach me that the life eternal is not merely the life beyond the grave, but the life on this side of the grave. Reveal to me that I am now in eternity." Matheson asked, how could trust exist with the divine if there were no darkness? It is our sense of emptiness that we are filled. Often in his manse on the banks of the River Clyde, Matheson wrote of the silence of the night, in the void, in the solitude of the night. He encouraged his parishioners to practice stillness and silence. The first reflection of Matheson which caught my attention decades ago was his commentary on the Transfiguration in the Gospel of St. Mark. The passage reads, let me read the passage from Mark's Gospel. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling bright, such as no one on earth could brighten them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. For me, it was Matheson who said, "Did you notice that Jesus' clothes were dazzling bright? The hillside was lit up, flooded with light. But where did the voice of God come from? From the cloud that overshadowed them." Matheson said that in all the brilliance of the entire scene, the voice of God came from the darkness, the impenetrable darkness. God is always hidden and elusive. I just think that's a beautiful piece of scripture. Finally, I return to the 20th century, to the painful and extraordinary spiritual journeying of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Like all human beings, not without her critics, but her spiritual insight is, in my opinion, monumental. She wrote, "If I ever become a saint, it will surely be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven, to light the light of those in darkness on earth." Spiritually, Mother Teresa struggled for many years. Her sense of God's absence tortured her. The heart of Jesus was her first love. In time, she said she came to love the darkness. She saw it as part of the darkness and pain of Jesus on earth. And God's hidden presence nurtured her longing and thirst. Elsewhere, she said that she was not alone because she had the darkness of God and the pain of God. So let me close with a final prayer which Dionysius offers, and this is what Dionysius wrote. "Unto this darkness which is beyond light, we pray that we may come, and may attain unto vision through the loss of sight and knowledge, and that in ceasing thus to see or to know, we may learn to know that which is beyond all perception and understanding. For this emptying of our faculties is true sight and knowledge." Thank you. I thought what was interesting actually was, I was listening to you, and I'm very grateful for your talk actually, and learned a great deal, is just how much overlap it seemed to me, how substantial overlap it seemed to me that you were expressing that I went on to express. I'm sure that resonates with you.
Absolutely. I was going to say the same thing, and I think there are two reasons for that. One is I'm convinced that the mystics of all the great religious traditions kind of find similar insights, which may point to some actual truth that underlies all of them, or at least point to the fact that we're all human beings and our brains function, our minds function in similar sorts of ways when we think about the greatest questions. You could take that either way, but the other reason, certainly when it comes to Judaism and Christianity, and to some extent Islam as well, is that there was a lot of interchange. I mean, we don't know very much about it. When you speak, for instance, about Dionysius, the pseudo Dionysius, who had a lot of influence, I think, on John Scotus Erigena in the 11th century, who in turn probably had a lot of influence on some of the texts that I was quoting. Although, Jews and Christians didn't always get along terribly well, to put it mildly, Jewish and Christian scholars were often aware of what sort of discussions were happening and possibly had discussions amongst themselves from time to time. So I think there's both of those elements, a sort of historical sort of cross-fertilization, but then the sort of deep psychological sort of convergence, as it were. But yeah, it is very striking. And I like the way that you brought in much more of the sense of darkness as the struggle that we have in this world. I didn't dwell too much on that, but there's a lot of that in Jewish mysticism as well, and the time of exile as a sort of the long night of exile, the darkness through which we have to labor in order to come to the daytime of redemption and so forth, and a lot of imagery of that sort. But that of course, those who like Elie Wiesel, for instance, who went through the concentration camps also spoke about it. Elie Wiesel wrote a novel called Night, which was about his experiences in Auschwitz. But it wasn't simply that it was horrific, which obviously it was, but that in that suffering something of God was revealed. There's a famous passage in Night where that becomes very explicit. But that sort of... Oh, the other thing, of course, sorry, I'll let you talk in a minute, but I just wanted to say that St. John of the Cross and his great sort of colleague and inspiration, St. Therese of Avila, while among the greatest Christian mystics, and very much Christian mystics, were, I think it's generally agreed, both of converso ancestry. Their grandparents, perhaps, or thereabouts, had been amongst those who converted due to the persecutions in Spain. So, and some people speculate whether there were some hidden strands of Jewish Kabbalistic thought that got in. I think it's unlikely, but there's blood. Yeah, sorry, over to you.
Thank you for that. And I suppose, because I was trying to talk about, rather than give a lecture on Christian mysticism, I suppose I wanted to talk in part about my own spiritual journey. And I suppose in my own journey, a congregation of New Age Trinity, Mayfield, Salisbury, are fed up hearing this. But actually, for me, always there was a sense of that regular theology, typical theology, was just not enough. It wasn't. It just wasn't expressing the hard reality of the world. And I think sometimes in Christianity there's a temptation to jump to the resurrection and not take full account of the darkness. And I just find so many theologies just a bit too trite. Whereas I think, and so it was a joy to me decades ago to discover this kind of strain within Christianity first, and then actually in other religions, to recognise that I think the mystics have a dissatisfaction with what you would call orthodox theology, certainly within Christianity. And the church has never liked the mystics. The giant of the mystics, John of Meister Eckhart, was probably going to be executed by the church. Fortunately, he died on the route to execution. But I mean, there's no doubt that the church does not like mystics. And one of the core reasons they don't like mystics is because the mystics have union with God. They don't need the clergy or the sacraments and that sort of thing. Yeah. Which is healthy, I think. Yeah.
Shall we see what questions people have?
In the light of what you have said, should we interpret the end of the Psalm 88 in a more positive way? Darkness is my only friend.
I love your question. I don't think I have a very ready response. There's something. The darkness can mean so many different things, as we've both said, and there are times when the presence of other people can be unbearable, and darkness symbolizes that sort of wanting to be away from everything and everyone else, and finding some solace in that, however lonely, however desolate it might be, but also sometimes necessary. But I don't have anything more profound to say. Yeah.
Hello, Scott. I want to air one or two things with you. The first thing is that there's a contradiction in what you're saying. When you quoted from the Cloud of Unknowing, you were suggesting that in fact we couldn't know the essence of God. But then when you quoted from Matheson, and when we look at Meister Eckhart, we find that this isn't really quite the case. And both of these people are offering union, which I think I would read as being, the knowing that the inner essence of ourselves, in other words, the higher intellect, as Eckhart would, is uncreate. So it's part of the Vedanta would say, "Thou art that," that we are, and I would feel that this perhaps comes around to what you said about your own sort of journey. You know, what's the difference between faith and belief? Because at one point you made this idea that, or said a sentence that suggested that faith and belief were the same thing. And I wonder whether they are. You see, I feel that faith is a sort of vision, a gnosis, if you like, whereas belief is to do with doctrine and things like that. And so that then it comes to the idea of which is on a higher level, gnosis or agape. And you definitely, I think it was, I can't remember where it was you quoted from. Perhaps it was R.S. Thomas. He was saying that, you know, that love is the greater of the two, whereas someone like Meister Eckhart would say that love is something that is bound up with desire and is therefore on a more sort of mundane level than gnosis, which has a sort of purity. And that brings us perhaps to the idea of you talked about intuition, and one wonders whether the heart, which of course for the Jews and for the Greeks is the organ of perception and of ratiocination, the heart has a higher reason than the ordinary reason, and in the ordered person, then the heart, the intellect, the true intellect, is the master of the ordinary intellect, the reason. And if it's that way round, I mean, these are just thoughts I had. I mean, I'm not trying to create an argument. You know that I'm a through and through heretic. You know that.
I think in what you've said that I disagree with. I think the first thing to say is I wouldn't want to imply that all mystics are saying the same thing. And since you're right about that, and you're right about the cloud of unknowing, in the sense the author is trying to talk about loving God. Whereas Eckhart wouldn't do that. I quite accept that. I wasn't trying to promote a thesis that they all say the same thing. Quite agree.
Sorry, this might sound a bit stupid maybe, but I was wondering, in Scotland on a day like today, you may not be particularly keen to get more of the darkness. while on the other hand, if you are roaming in the desert of the Sinai, maybe a little cloud is already some relief. So there might be some kind of feeling which we have. So all of us have experienced this kind of being beyond words, namely when we were very little and somehow we grew up. And it's very important, I think, that we remember that we come from this, that this is our core where we grew up from. And this should not just be forgotten in the whatever regulations we have to survive. So I was wondering, couldn't there be some kind of very simple explanations for some of the spiritual insights?
I think that you're right about obviously the desert is very, very bright light, but actually the night is very, very dark, much darker than we would have, certainly in Edinburgh. And I think darkness actually. We talked earlier about almost like yin and yang. It's across cultures, and all of these predate electricity, of course. Mm-hmm. And that's a factor. There's no question about that. But I still think it resonates deeply as a metaphor. Resonates really deeply as a metaphor, even though there's obviously physical reasons why people might have done that.
Maybe I could just ask or ask your thoughts on it. So. Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, talks about the necessity of going through darkness, which I've thought a lot about it, in the present times. And I just wondered, whether you had any thoughts on that, where that fits in.
Thank you. I have to confess I'm not familiar with the Ramchal that much, so you probably know more about that than I do. That sounds very interesting and something I'd like to follow up. I've never really studied the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto from the kind of late 18th, early 19th century, great, somewhat heretical as well, sort of Italian Kabbalist and moralist. But I didn't know about what he says about darkness, so that sounds very interesting. Sounds a little bit like John of the Cross to me, but who knows if you knew about Carmelite spirituality. Yeah,
I think I agree about John of the Cross, and I would say that no one no one would want bad things to happen in their life. It's certainly not. And that's obviously true, and I put that out there. It is also true that sometimes in life, bad things happen to us that lead us into a place of darkness, from which, if we emerge, is actually becomes a place of growth for us. Now, I'm not saying that we would want to encourage that, or look for that, or promote that, but things come our way that sometimes takes us into places of darkness, which might be an instant or years, and you'll know that. I mean, from times, perhaps more experience, you emerge as a deeper human being, with a deeper insight. But again, you wouldn't want to go out of your way to look for that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you. This will be the last one, so I'm hoping it's not too long. No, go. Okay.
I was very taken with the notion that darkness blurs distinctions, where you began. And therefore you said that darkness unites. I was thinking of Moses or the other patriarchs when they say, Hineni, I am here, which is their self-identification, and maybe it's a form of humility. I am here as something distinct. I have a distinction. I have an identity. I am in the light. I am here. I am humble. I'm not in the darkness. I'm human. Therefore, I am distinct. But how does one get in the Jewish tradition? How does one move from Hineni? I am here. I am a distinct, humble, identifiable creature. How does one get from that to the blurring of distinction in the divine? How does one reach darkness from Hineni?
Well, that is a powerful question for us to finish with. Really makes me think. I'm not sure I think of Hineni primarily as a statement of one's sort of independent reality so much. I think I would think of Hineni, which is what Abraham says when God calls him to do the unthinkable, as it were, and sacrifice Isaac, as I'm ready. I'm ready to do, I'm ready and waiting, rather than I am me. But that's a very interesting question, and it will make me reflect. It also reminds me of the first question that, I think it's the first question that God addresses to humanity, which is, Ayeka, where are you? Yeah. And of course, that's when Adam and Eve were trying to hide from God, thinking that you can hide from God. And of course, God knows where they are, but God says, where are you? And the answer, not the answer that Adam and Eve give in that story, but the answer that, as you say, others give later is, Hineni, I'm ready. Here I am for you. So I think it's more about relationship than about sort of existential independence, as it were. But it's a great question, and I have to reflect on it. Thank you, Nigel.
Okay, I know Janet's looking at me because we have to draw to an end. I took down lots of things, but I'm going to keep it very brief because we had two excellent orators tonight that drew on so many different materials from light and darkness. The Torah, the Zohar, Maimonides, John, the New Testament, Mother Teresa, Matheson. I mean, immense, and enriched our darkness through doing that. Just the couple of things I took as like messages. that, which I think is a helpful message today, is to deepen our own spiritual life, whatever's going on around us, however hard it is, however the struggle is, and most people have their own personal struggles, and we certainly have worldwide struggles. And the value of being in the darkness, and as you both said, together, that we're actually not alone in the darkness, and darkness has a depth to it, which sometimes we forget about. And it's interesting that the soul returns every night to heaven, and we get it again the next day, which I'm sure, is very significant. The ordinary series of Learning for All, which is always related to the Torah, and then we wanted to do an Interfaith series, and indeed it's in the memory of my late son, Andrew, and he always related through his soul, through his inner self, and I think that was a lesson to me. And I think you've all helped us tonight to get through some of the struggles. We don't get through them, but we stick on in there. So I want to thank you both on behalf of everybody very, very much.